In every neighborhood, in every apartment building, people live side by side. We hear footsteps through the ceiling, doors shutting down the hall, and the hum of voices through thin walls. These sounds are normal, expected. But for one young woman, the noises she heard in her apartment weren't the harmless sounds of everyday life. They were warnings. Signs of something she could never have imagined. This is the story of a neighbor who didn't just live next door, but inside the very walls of her home. She had recently moved into a small apartment on the third floor of an older building. At first, she enjoyed the quiet. The hallways were rarely crowded, the neighbors kept to themselves, and the building carried a certain charm: tall windows, creaking wood floors, and thick walls that seemed to hold history within them. But not long after she settled in, she began to notice small, unexplained details. At night, while reading in bed, she heard a faint scratching sound. Not loud, not constant, just a steady drag along the walls, as if nails or fingertips were moving slowly from the inside. She brushed it off, telling herself it was pipes expanding or maybe a mouse. Yet the sound returned again the following night. And the night after that. The noise wasn't random. It was always in the same place, the wall beside her bed. Days passed, and she began to see other troubling signs. Small amounts of food disappeared from her fridge. A yogurt she swore she hadn't eaten. A sandwich she had prepared for work, missing from its container. At first, she blamed herself. Maybe she had forgotten. Maybe she had misplaced things. But the pattern grew too clear to ignore. When she asked her neighbors upstairs and downstairs if they ever heard scratching or voices through the vents, they shook their heads. One even laughed and said, "This building's quiet. You're lucky. No noise here." But she wasn't lucky. Something was happening. Something she couldn't explain. Late at night, when the world outside was silent, she began to hear whispers. They weren't the muffled conversations of neighbors through the wall. These whispers were closer. Softer. As if they were being spoken just a few feet away, through the vents, through the thin cracks that ran along her apartment. She lay frozen in her bed, straining to listen. The words were too faint to understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone was speaking, and they were speaking from inside her walls. Her fear grew stronger when she found a small hole drilled near the corner of her bedroom. It wasn't a nail hole. It wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Perfectly round, and positioned at the exact height of her bed. She called maintenance immediately. The man who arrived took one look at the hole, laughed nervously, and told her it was probably the result of old wiring. The scratching? Probably just rats. He patched the hole quickly, assuring her there was nothing to worry about. But that night, lying in bed, she felt eyes on her. Even with the hole patched, the sense of being watched was unbearable. And the scratching, it returned, louder than before, moving along the wall in slow, dragging patterns. One night, around 3 a.m., she was jolted awake. Something was wrong. Her bedroom was cold. Too cold. And then she saw it, her closet door. It was open. Just slightly. She was sure she had closed it before going to bed. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared into the dark gap of the closet. And then she heard it. Breathing. Deep, steady, human breathing, coming from inside. She didn't move. She didn't dare. She reached slowly for her phone, her hand shaking as she dialed for help. The police arrived minutes later. They entered the apartment with flashlights drawn, searching every room, every corner. And then, they opened the closet. Behind a thin false wall, hidden behind her clothes and boxes, they found a small passage. It led directly into the hollow space inside the walls of her apartment. And inside that space, they found him. A man, filthy, thin, his clothes in tatters. He had been living there for months. Slipping out when she left, stealing her food, and returning to hide inside the walls. He had created a maze of crawlspaces, carving holes to watch her, moving through the building unseen. And the worst part? He wasn't a stranger. He was a former tenant. A neighbor who had moved out, but never really left. The police took him away, but many questions remained unanswered. How long had he been there before she moved in? How often had he stood in the darkness, inches away, watching her sleep? The woman never spent another night in that apartment. She packed her things and left immediately. To this day, no one knows how long he had been living inside the walls. Or what might have happened if she hadn't discovered him when she did. Would you be able to stay in that apartment another night after that discovery? Neighbors can become like family. We share fences, wave across driveways, and exchange kind gestures that build trust over time. In most communities, neighbors are the first people you turn to when you need help. They watch your house while you're away, keep an eye on your children, and offer a sense of safety. But sometimes, the very person you welcome with open arms is the one you should fear the most. This is the story of a suburban family who believed they had found a kind-hearted neighbor, a man who seemed like a grandfather to everyone around him. He baked cookies, told stories, and carried himself with the warmth of a trusted friend. But behind closed doors, he was hiding a truth so disturbing that when it finally came out, the entire neighborhood would never look at him the same way again. The Johnson family had just moved into a quiet cul-de-sac. The street was lined with trimmed hedges, well-kept lawns, and houses where families had lived for years. It felt safe. It felt welcoming. Within days, they met their new neighbor, Mr. Harris. He was in his late 60s, gray-haired, soft-spoken, with a friendly smile that put everyone at ease. He came to their door carrying a plate of cookies, introducing himself as the person who had lived next door for decades. From that moment on, he was everywhere. He waved each morning as the Johnsons left for work and school. He stopped by on weekends to chat in the driveway. He even offered to help mow their lawn when Mr. Johnson was busy. The children loved him. He told them stories from his youth, taught them little card tricks, and always had candy tucked in his pockets. To the Johnsons, he was harmless. To the rest of the neighborhood, he was beloved. For months, there was no reason to suspect anything unusual. Mr. Harris was polite, dependable, and seemed to enjoy being part of the family's lives. He became, in many ways, the grandfather the children never had. But soon, things started to change. Small details began to catch the family's attention. And those details, once put together, painted a very different picture of the man next door. It began with sounds at night. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, the Johnsons would hear a garage door opening, then closing. Sometimes they heard what sounded like muffled voices or cries, carried faintly by the wind. At first, they dismissed it. Perhaps he was doing late-night woodworking. Maybe he was restless and couldn't sleep. But the family dog reacted differently. Each time Mr. Harris approached the fence, the dog growled and barked furiously. The animal, normally calm and playful, seemed unable to relax around him. Then came the first real sign that something was wrong. One afternoon, the Johnsons' youngest child, only 7 years old, mentioned something casually at dinner. With an innocent voice, he said, "Mr. Harris shows me things in his basement." The table went silent. The parents exchanged uneasy looks. They pressed for details, but the child only shrugged, saying it was just some stuff and quickly moved on. The parents didn't want to overreact. This was the neighbor everyone trusted, after all. Maybe it was just old furniture, or tools. But the thought of their child alone in his basement unsettled them deeply. Over the following weeks, the late-night noises grew louder. More frequent. Sometimes, the parents thought they heard sharp bangs, as if heavy objects were being dropped or dragged. Once, they swore they heard a scream, faint but undeniable, before it was cut off. The friendly smile of their neighbor no longer felt so comforting. The cookies, the stories, the kindness, all of it suddenly carried a weight of unease. Something was very wrong, but they couldn't yet prove it. Finally, unable to ignore their instincts, the Johnsons decided to confront him. One afternoon, they approached Mr. Harris politely in his yard. They asked about the noises, about the basement, about their son's comment. His smile never faded. He laughed lightly, brushing it off as a misunderstanding. "I work on projects down there. Old furniture. That's probably what your boy saw. And as for the noises, well, these old houses make all kinds of sounds at night, don't they?" His answer was calm, but it didn't erase their doubt. In fact, it only made it stronger. A few days later, the Johnsons weren't the only ones suspicious. Other neighbors had begun whispering, too. Stories of missing pets, unexplained noises, and odd behavior that nobody had pieced together until now. Then, everything changed. One night, multiple police cars descended on the quiet street. Flashing lights filled the cul-de-sac as officers surrounded Mr. Harris's home. The Johnsons watched from their window as their neighbor was led out in handcuffs, his head down, his expression blank. What investigators found inside was far worse than anyone had imagined. In the basement were boxes of disturbing photographs, personal belongings from people who had gone missing in the area, and evidence linking him to unsolved crimes that stretched back years. He had hidden everything in plain sight, all while walking the streets as a trusted friend and neighbor. For the Johnsons, the realization was devastating. This man had been in their home. He had played with their children. He had stood at their dinner table, smiling as if he was part of the family. Every wave, every smile across the fence, now carried a chilling new meaning. To the rest of the world, he had been a kind old man. To those who knew the truth, he was something far darker. The Johnsons never forgot. They never trusted so easily again. And whenever they remembered Mr. Harris, one thought echoed in their minds: the worst monsters often hide behind the friendliest faces. Would you ever trust a neighbor completely after hearing this? There are sounds you expect to hear at night. The hum of a refrigerator, the faint creak of pipes, or the muffled voices of neighbors through thin apartment walls. These are familiar sounds, easy to dismiss. But what if every night, at the exact same time, you were woken by screams? Not laughter, not arguments, but raw, painful screams of a person in distress. And what if you were the only one who heard them? This is the story of a tenant who moved into a rundown apartment building, hoping for peace and privacy. Instead, he found himself trapped in a nightmare that no one else could hear, and no one could explain. When David signed the lease, he didn't expect luxury. The building was old, the walls were thin, and the hallways smelled faintly of mildew. But the rent was cheap, and it was close to his job. He told himself he could deal with the flaws. The first week was uneventful. The usual noise of city life filled the air, cars passing, neighbors walking above him, the occasional shouting match down the street. But then, on the seventh night, everything changed. At exactly 2:33 in the morning, David woke suddenly. From the apartment next door came the sound of screaming. At first, he thought someone was being attacked. The cries were sharp, panicked, filled with terror. He sat up in bed, his heart racing, waiting for the sounds to stop or for someone else to react. But no one did. The next morning, he asked the landlord about it. The landlord frowned, then shook his head. "That unit is vacant. Has been for months." David laughed nervously, convinced there had been some mistake. But that night, at the same time, the screaming returned. Louder. More desperate. And again, no one else seemed to hear it. Night after night, the sounds continued. At 2:33 sharp, the screams would erupt through the wall. They weren't always the same. Some nights it was the sound of a woman crying, pleading for help. Other nights, the noise was violent, heavy thuds, furniture crashing, the unmistakable sound of fists pounding against walls. David began to lose sleep. He tried covering his ears, playing music, even sleeping in the living room. Nothing helped. At 2:33, the noise pierced through. One night, in frustration, he pounded on the wall with his fist. Instantly, the screams stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise itself. He sat there, waiting, but nothing resumed. For a moment, he thought he had scared off whoever, or whatever, was making the noise. But the following night, the screams returned, just as before. Growing desperate, David decided to record the sounds. He set his phone near the wall, hit record, and waited. As expected, at 2:33 the chaos began. He listened to every second of it, the cries, the crashes, the begging. But when he played back the recording, something else appeared. Amid the screams, a voice whispered his name. Clear. Direct. As though someone was standing inches from the microphone. His blood ran cold. No one should have known his name. And yet, the recording left no doubt. The next day, David went back to the landlord. He demanded answers. But again, the landlord insisted, the unit was empty. To prove it, David hired a locksmith. Together, they entered the apartment next door. The moment the door swung open, David's stomach dropped. The unit was stripped bare. No furniture, no signs of life. Just empty rooms. But the silence inside felt heavy, like the air itself was holding secrets. Then they reached the living room. Every wall was covered in long, jagged scratch marks, as though someone had clawed at the plaster for hours, desperate to get out. Some marks ran so deep they exposed the wooden beams beneath. In the center of the room stood a single chair. Nothing else. Just a chair, positioned perfectly to face the wall David shared with his own apartment. David's knees went weak. He realized that for weeks, the screams had been coming not just from this unit, but from directly against the wall where he slept. Shaken, he left the apartment, refusing to step foot inside again. The locksmith locked it back up, neither of them saying much. There was nothing more to do, at least not that night. David tried to convince himself it was over. He had seen the room. He had proof that no one lived there. Maybe it was all in his head. Maybe the stress and lack of sleep had twisted his senses. But the next night, at 2:33, the screams returned. Only this time, they weren't coming from the empty unit. They were coming from inside David's own apartment. The cries filled every corner, echoing off the walls. He grabbed his phone, his keys, anything he could carry, and fled into the hallway. He never returned to that apartment again. And to this day, he still wonders, were the screams real? Or had something followed him out of that empty room? He never stayed to find out. Do you think this was supernatural or something far more disturbing? Share your thoughts in the comment.